This is the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. One of the most common sex problems that people report today is that they can't seem to clear their mind and really be present during sex. They're thinking about something else. They're distracted, or they're multitasking, and that's getting in the way of their ability to experience pleasure. In today's show, we're going to be talking about why this problem seems to be on the rise and what we can do about it. Specifically, we're going to learn about how to have embodied sex. This is the kind of sex that allows us to get out of our heads and into the moment. We'll discuss tips for practicing embodiment in everyday life in order to build up the skill, and also how to apply this in the bedroom. I am joined by Dr. Emily Jamia, an ASEX certified sex therapist based in Houston, Texas. Emily is also a sex educator and researcher with over 15 years of experience. Dr. Jamia hosts the popular Love and Libido podcast and offers online workshops to help people improve their intimate lives and relationships. She is author of the new book, Anatomy of Desire: 5 Secrets to Create Connection and Cultivate Passion. This is going to be an amazing conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you ever find yourself dreaming about a career where you get to talk about sex and psychology all day long? What if I told you there's a place that can connect you with world-class experts and has a large, thriving community? Sexual Health Alliance does just that. Sexual Health Alliance helps you to build the career of your dreams and is at the forefront of sexuality education. Students come from all parts of the world and from all types of backgrounds. Whether you're in school just starting out on your journey or building advanced skills in your profession, Sexual Health Alliance's comprehensive certifications, engaging events, and self-paced online education will move you beyond the basics and set you up to become sexceptional. Visit sexualhealthalliance.com and start building the sexuality career of your dreams today. And let them know that you heard about Sexual Health Alliance on this podcast. Hi, Emily, and welcome back to the Sex and Psychology Podcast.
Hi, Justin. Thank you so much for having me back on the show. It's a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you. So we're going to be talking about your new book titled Anatomy of Desire. But before we dive in, can you please tell us the brief story behind this book? So what was the inspiration for it?
Absolutely. So I had reached a point in my career where it was relatively simple to help people overcome things like erectile difficulty. I could help women have better orgasms. I could help people overcome sexual pain issues, and I could improve desire to a degree. But I found that a lot of people would come back to their quote unquote accountability appointments saying like, we're better than we were when we first started seeing you, but we're still longing for more. We want more passion. We want sex to feel like it did in the honeymoon stage. And I would say, well, that's a temporary neurochemical cocktail. It's not sustainable. Or they'd say, we want sex like it seems to be in the movies. And I'd remind them those are paid actors, yada, yada. But I knew what they wanted. And so I started paying closer attention to the language that they were using to describe the sex they wanted. Words like effortless. I want to feel lost in the moment. I want the world around me to disappear. And I'm like, they're talking about a flow state. And so I turned to the academic literature to see what I could find on the relationship between flow state and great sex and came up blank. There was like one paper that looked at kind of a small sample of couples who practice BDSM, but there was no large scale studies that looked at the relationship between flow state and sexual satisfaction. And for people listening who don't know, flow state is a term that was coined decades ago by this Hungarian-American psychologist named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And it describes the state of mind we get into when we are engaged in an activity in which we experience that loss of space and time, rapid attention and focus. And most people can think of something in their life that puts them into a flow state. Usually it's something artistic or athletic, but there just wasn't anything out there about sex. So I initiated a research study, I published my findings, and then I called up my research participants who got the highest scores and had really long conversations with them about what specifically they did to get into a flow state during sex. And through those interviews, these 5 themes emerged, which kind of set the outline up for the book.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And I'm looking forward to diving into those themes. But before we get into that, early on in your book, you talk about how one of the more common complaints that you hear as a sex therapist is that people can't clear their minds and really be present during sex. And you say that this seems to be a new problem. It's not one that sex therapists really dealt with before the information age. So tell us a little bit about this. How is our modern world making it harder for us to be present during sex?
Oh my gosh, in so many ways. I think the biggest inhibitor as it relates to sex is technology has allowed us to multitask more than ever before. We can do 2 or 3 things at once. I mean, rarely do I go to the gym and not see people with earbuds in their ear, most likely because they're listening to, music or a podcast, something like that. If you're listening to this podcast, I'll let you have a pass. But we're constantly multitasking, and so you cannot expect to go from split attention all day long to the singular focus of sex. Rarely do we sit down to a meal and not also check social media or our email, or even at the end of the day, sitting with our partner, we're trying to connect and maybe watch a TV show together. People have their phone in their hand. So we constantly have this split attention. And I think in addition to that, we are more overcommitted than we have ever been. I mean, I just saw something come out today, I think, that said mothers spend as much time with their kids today as they did like 60 years ago, but they're working more than ever. So, I mean, we are just stretched thin. And what we know is that it takes time to get into a focused state. And I think what happens for a lot of people is they're running around all day long. Their nervous systems are kind of always firing and in an activated state. And then we get into bed and we wonder why we can't get into our bodies. And so, my advice to people as it relates to that is to slow down as much as possible. And I include in the book, little tips that people can do that don't take more than like 30 to 60 seconds that can go a long way in helping disconnect from the mind, quiet it down so that they can get back into the body.
Yeah, I mean, something for listeners to think about is just, as you go through the day, what are some things that you do where you're not multitasking? And you might find it's actually really hard to come up with anything, right? Because when a lot of people are even just watching TV to relax, they're also checking their phone at the same time. When they're eating, they might be watching TV or checking their phone. When they're driving or at the gym or in the shower, they might be listening to music or a podcast. And, our attention is divided constantly, like throughout the day. Some of us are just in this perpetual state of multitasking. And so once you start to recognize that, I think it becomes easier to see how, oh, maybe it is a good idea for us to learn how to shut our brains down a little bit. Because when you're primed to focus on multiple things at once, that's going to make it really hard during sex to just focus on the sex and not be thinking about other things that you need to do. And while it might sound nice to be efficient, and get other things done while you're having sex, you're probably not going to have great sex if your mind is elsewhere.
So true. And, if you think of the kinds of activities more traditionally that put people into a flow state, let's say surfing or snow skiing or playing a musical instrument, like there's a lead up that you have to go through to get into a flow state. In fact, we know that you have to go through a series of stages before you can even get into a flow state. And the first is called the struggle stage. This is where we're actually flooded with stress hormones, or the brain is overloaded with information. I go to a surfing analogy a lot, so you can think of a surfer waxing their board or paddling out, and they don't know if like a good wave is going to come, but they sit around and they wait. They don't throw the towel in, just because a good wave doesn't come immediately. Or an artist who has to spend time mixing their oils and preparing their canvas. Like there's a little bit of a lead up that people have to go through. But for some reason, when it comes to sex, we expect to get into that state of mind with the snap of a finger, and it just doesn't work like that. A lot of us don't have sex for as long as it takes to get into a focused state. And so what I encourage people to do is to do things ahead of time that will help kind of prime that neural pathway to be still, to be embodied, and to prepare for focus, so that when you do get into bed, you can get from point A to point B a bit more quickly.
And I think that's such an important point. This idea that sex is often over before we've even had a chance to get into a flow state. So, yeah, super important. Now, you talk about one of the keys to shutting off our minds and being present during sex as being embodied. But you say that rather than being aware of the body, we need to become aware as the body. So, tell us a little bit more about this. What does it mean to become aware as the body? What does that look like or feel like?
Let me back it up to answer that question. Mindfulness, I think, has become such a buzzword. And mindfulness is a great first step in that when you maybe have an intrusive thought, you notice the thought, hopefully without judgment or reaction, and then consciously bring yourself back into the five senses. But that's sort of an active, repetitive process. People who are embodied are so in touch with the five senses that there's not really a whole lot of conscious thought happening. Peggy Kleinplatz even talks about this in her work on optimal sex. I think she had one client who said something along the lines of, my hand went there because that's where it wanted to go. So it's almost like your body has a mind of its own, which can go a long way when it comes to experiencing sexual pleasure. So rather than thinking like, what do I need externally to feel good on the genitals? It's like, let me just be my genitals for a second and just like experience the sexual moment through that pathway rather than from this kind of top down process that I think so many people get trapped in.
Be the genitals. Love it.
Be your penis, be your clitoris. Exactly.
Well, and that's interesting. It has me thinking about how it's just sort of a different way of approaching sex. I think in recent years, a lot of our conversations around sex have been about making it this very higher level sort of process where you're thinking through everything and where, you're also stopping and checking in with your partner at each stage. The idea of enthusiastic consent that you're going to keep going and checking in, constantly with your partner, just I think kind of has people thinking about sex as this activity that you kind of necessarily need to overthink, where you're not really in the moment so much and as connected to your partner. So this is just kind of a different way of having sex. It doesn't mean that it doesn't align with these other consent structures and models, but just that I think when people think about the best sex that they've had, it's usually where they're more in the moment, where they are acting like as their bodies and they just kind of are totally attuned with their partner and just kind of have this implicit sense of what each other one wants.
Yes, yes, and yes. I am just like nodding the whole time you're talking because, yes, communication is important. Obviously, consent is important, but I'm actually not a fan of this like constant enthusiastic consent that has to happen at like every single stage in the sexual act because I think it really detracts from the experience. I try to get people to a place where they can let their bodies do the talking. You use the word attune, and I have a whole chapter on attunement for that very reason. And the analogy I refer back to a lot is like a pair of ballroom dancers who appear to move as one unit, or a sports team. Like they cannot stop mid-game and talk through every single play. Like at some point, they are attuning to each other's nonverbal cues. And we have to learn to do the same during sex. A lot of what I write about in this book is taking sex to that kind of upper echelon of pleasure and satisfaction. If you take it down a notch, yes, verbal communication and talking through likes and dislikes, those are really important first steps, consent, of course, but at some point, let your body do the talking and learn to attune to each other's nonverbal cues.
And that's where I think we can also learn something from the kink and BDSM community, where so much of the consent communication happens well in advance of any sexual interaction, where you've negotiated and determined things before sex has even begun. And, to the extent that people can adopt that model of sex, I think that creates the opportunity to be more embodied and attuned and in the moment and not overthinking sex quite as much.
So true. And I'll just add to that, it was no surprise to me that the one paper I did find looked at couples who practice BDSM because I think there is so much we can learn as it relates to that. Like 99% of sex therapists will say that you shouldn't have goal-oriented sex. Well, people in the kink community and BDSM are very clear about what they're wanting out of a sexual experience. And sure enough, one of the 8 components of flow that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi outlined is this idea of clear goals with immediate feedback. I kind of come from that place. I think the more clear we are about what we're wanting from a sexual experience, which involves some communication ahead of time, the more we can just relax and enjoy the experience.
Yeah, makes total sense to me. So, how can we learn to become more embodied during sex? So, if you're somebody who really struggles to get out of your head, or you find yourself frequently distracted or multitasking during sex, how do you shut that off and enter a more embodied state? So, in your book, you talk about how we can learn to practice this in everyday life, how we can practice it in our relationship, and also how we can practice it in moments of pleasure. So, let's talk about each one of those in turn. Let's start with the things you can do just in daily life to start feeling more embodied.
For sure. When you eat, just eat. When you go for a walk, just walk. When you're at the gym, just work out. The more you do just one thing at a time, the more able you are to get in touch with each of the 5 senses and the experience as the body through any one of those tasks, which I think acts as, there's kind of a muscle memory component. So it primes those pathways and makes it easier to focus on the singular act of sex. So that's one thing. Another thing I think that's important to do individually is, as much as possible, see where you can trim some fat from your life. I've had to work really hard and knowing when to say no, because I know when I put too much on my plate, my nervous system is in overdrive. It's too much information going, through my head at any given point. There's people to manage, places to be, and we become like a human doing as opposed to a human being. One thing I say in the book is, yeah, it's really satisfying to like cross things off a to-do list, but that's not what you remember. When you reflect back on really pleasurable times in life, it's usually the more embodied sensual experiences, like the perfect day at the beach or this amazing hike you did. So we've got to carve time out for that sort of thing. I think being in nature is a really great and simple way to be more embodied. Just, taking your feet off and putting them on the ground is very grounding. So things like that can go a long way.
Yeah. And, this is something that I think a lot of us, myself included, struggle with, that ability to just focus on one thing at a time. And when I'm able to do that, it is very transformative and it really stands out in my memory, like those experiences where it's like I'm sitting here focused just on this one thing that I'm experiencing, whether it's me outside for a walk and I'm noticing the feeling of the sun on my skin and the smell of the air, and like you're tapped into all of your senses. And it's just a very different kind of experience. And so when you think about applying that in the world of sex, that's going to be transformative in terms of the way that your body, your senses, all of that is going to experience sex.
So true. And this theme I try to mirror in each of the chapters. So much of this starts outside the bedroom, with each person as an individual. And what I tell people is we are born with each of these qualities. The 5 secrets that are outlined: sensuality, curiosity, adaptability, vulnerability, and attunement. Like, we're born with this stuff. Anyone who has small children can attest to the fact that they are exploring the world completely through their 5 senses. And so I am of the mind that this is not a matter of becoming someone you're not. This is about reconnecting with qualities that are there within all of us.
Yeah. Now, you talk in your book about how intimate touch is so important in relationships, but also how it can be a way of feeling more embodied. So, tell us a little bit about the power of touch and how we can leverage it to enhance our relationships and also create more embodiment.
Sure. So, humans need touch. And I think, again, this day and age, we are kind of desperate for it. The pandemic obviously highlighted that for a lot of people. You talk to people who visit like sex workers, and there's a pretty good percentage of them that go just to cuddle with these women because they feel so deprived of touch. So many of my clients will report feeling like they live like two ships passing in the night, where again, just because they're so busy, we don't really work in these little daily rituals for touch. And so, what I encourage people to do is, at least on a daily basis, like give each other more than a peck, or stay in bed, hit the snooze button for a few minutes and just cuddle each other, or occasionally take a shower together, or instead of going to opposite ends of the sofa to watch your TV show at the end of the day, like make sure your bodies are touching and skin to skin as much as possible, because we get so much oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine and all the feel good chemicals from that physical touch, which again primes those pathways. You can't expect to run a marathon if you've never even walked around the block. And so we've got to kind of exercise that experience of touch if we're ready to, be fully embodied with our partner in bed. Couples who touch each other more handle conflict more effectively. Like there is just so much research to suggest that touch is really powerful in relationships.
And if you feel more embodied while you're receiving touch, that can make the touch feel all the more intense, right? Because when you're just there focusing on the sensations of your partner's breath on your skin or their fingers running down your back or however it is that you're being touched, it feels and is experienced so much more intensely if you're in this state of embodiment. But I think also just the act of touching your partner can also help to create that sense of embodiment because it kind of grounds you and brings you into the moment. Now, something else you discuss is how we can practice embodiment when we engage in self-pleasure. So walk us through how that works. How can somebody practice embodiment during masturbation, maybe as a way of building up to being more embodied during partnered sex?
Yeah. So, I think that by and large, women don't masturbate with as much regularity as men do. Men more and more when they masturbate are doing so with the use of internet porn. Not that there is anything wrong with that, but it's such a high external stimulus that it kind of disconnects from the internal emotional experience or physical experience rather. And so for people who are struggling to re-inhabit the body during sex, I'm like, let's just start with your own body, totally separate from anyone else's. And, do what you need to do to set the mood, to get comfortable, to relax, whether that's taking a bath or just lying under the covers for a little while. And then explore your body beyond the genitals, experimenting with different kinds of touch to see what feels good without any external stimulus to detract from the experience. And what I find a lot of people end up experiencing is greater pleasure, or like I have actually kind of hold the unpopular opinion that vibrators shouldn't be introduced too early into female sexual repertoire, because while they are great and, certainly for women who struggle with orgasms, like I'm totally pro vibrator, use it, they're great. But I am really a proponent of like touching our own bodies with our own hands because they're always accessible. I think it just builds a different neural pathway than something that's such a strong external stimulus.
This is reminding me of my study abroad course in Berlin that I taught earlier this year, where we did a rope tying workshop. And during this workshop, we were just tying ourselves up. And I was kind of like, I'm not sure how this is going to work, but our instructor kind of walked us through like some different exercises. And it was like, so feel the rope on your skin and then, practice tying this and that. And, what are the sensations that you're experiencing right now? And it was kind of this mindfulness rope tying exercise that really ended up being much more powerful than I ever expected it to be, because it was one of those things that really prompted you to be in the moment and pay attention to those sensations on your body and discover what you do like and what you don't like. And so I think there are all kinds of ways that you can apply this. And if you want to make it a little bit kinky and add rope to it or, some other toys or whatever, you can. But the idea is that you're just kind of exploring, experimenting with different sensations, different parts of the body. And it takes a little bit of practice to figure that out.
It does. And you have to push yourself outside your comfort zone a little bit. And it's something I talk about in the book, like experiment with a little bit of sensation play just to see how that feels. Because the fact that it's a bit new in and of itself will help draw your attention in. When we're presented with a novel stimulus, like we have to focus on it because it's new. And so if you've never felt the sensation of ice melting on your skin or the touch of a feather or a leather strap, I mean, do so on your own just to see what that feels like on the body and how your body responds. And I think a lot of people end up being very pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. So you've worked as a sex therapist for several years, and I know you've done a lot of work teaching your clients to feel more embodied. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about some of your success stories. So have your clients found this to be transformative and something that just totally changes their sex life and their relationship together?
I really have. And you know what I love about this model is I find it to be so approachable, for people. It's not very threatening to like most people aren't going to recoil when I say like when you pour yourself a cup of coffee in the morning, like just drink the coffee and don't listen to the news at the same time. They're like, okay, yeah, like I can do that. But yes, I am finding that these little shifts throughout the day have such a profound effect. And, these touch rituals that I give my clients, and I kind of created my own variation of sensate focus that I call the sensual lever. It's an exercise in the book which really helps partners to not just get in touch with their own bodily sensations, but also tap into those of their partner in a way that's really fun and exciting. And we kind of go through the five senses, the sound of your partner's heartbeat or the rhythm of their breathing and the way they smell. Like, when was the last time you stopped and just like smelled your partner and took that in? So many of us don't. But the reports from my clients have been, yeah, that is just transformational. And helping maintain eroticism, I think also like one of my clients said something along the lines of it feels now like it's this sort of constant energetic charge or erotic charge that we dip in and out of rather than something we turn on and off. And we can kind of turn up the heat up or down, just regardless of what we're feeling at any given moment. And so that I just think it makes it easier to attain for a lot of people, which has been nice. And it's approach, like I said before in the beginning of our conversation, flow is something that most people have experienced at some point in their life. So it's really a matter of transferring that mindset and those skills to something a lot of us are doing anyway to make it that much more enjoyable.
Yeah, I love all of that. Now, one last question about embodiment. So let's say you don't really have any issues being present during sex, but it's clear that your partner does, where they seem distracted or aren't fully present. Is there anything that you would recommend that people could do to maybe try and help their partner feel more embodied?
There was a study that came out not too long ago, I think a study on body image, and it found that physical touch for the person who was struggling with body image had a more profound effect on helping them feel better in their bodies than like telling them they looked good or that they didn't need to worry about their appearance. All that to be said, touch in and of itself can be really healing. I have people come through the office who will say things like, well, I'm just not a touchy feely person. But research on prescribed touch in couples finds that it's beneficial even for people who don't value it. So, my advice if someone is maybe a bit hesitant or reticent to start touching each other more, they say they don't think it's important, is to just encourage them to try anyway. Like, you don't have anything to lose. And we see this for people who maybe have trauma in their background, people for whom touch was unsafe or kind of activates the fight or flight system a little bit, that healthy touch can be healing to that earlier trauma. So my advice is to kind of fake it till you make it and trust in the process and know that in time it'll probably be beneficial to you both.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm looking forward to speaking more with you about other sex tips and secrets to cultivating passion in the next episode. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Emily. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Absolutely. Thank you, Justin. So the book is available everywhere books are sold. If you buy a copy, you can go to my website and get like tons of free bonuses. So be sure to check that out at emilyjamia.com. And then I'm on all the social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamia. And I have a podcast as well called Love and Libido. So be sure to check it out.
Well, and I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. It was really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Justin. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on Twitter and TikTok at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future episode of this show, you can leave me a podcast voicemail at speakpipe.com/sex and psychology. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.